In 2026, several prisoners faced their final days, having committed crimes so horrific that their fate was sealed in court. But despite years of legal battles, appeals, and desperate attempts to avoid execution, they will face the ultimate penalty. In this video, we'll uncover the chilling crimes that led to their death sentences and explore the courtrooms where they fought and failed to escape their fate. Stay tuned, because the stories you're about to hear will leave you questioning the very essence of justice. Before we begin, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of true crime enthusiasts. Tap the notification bell so you won't miss any of our future updates. James Earl Trimble. In the quiet, seemingly ordinary town of Brimfield, Ohio, a storm was brewing, a storm of violence and fear that would forever alter the lives of those who lived there. It was January 21st, 2005, when James Earl Trimble, a man with a history of violent outbursts and a troubled past, committed an act of unspeakable horror. In a home that should have been a sanctuary, Trimble unleashed a violent crime spree. A mother and her two children became the victims of a brutal robbery that escalated into murder. The crime was not just shocking for its brutality, it was chilling in its precision, a cold-blooded act that left a community in disbelief. Trimble, seeking money and fueled by a volatile mix of anger and desperation, entered the home, and within moments, lives were lost. A mother and her two children, innocent lives, were extinguished in an act of shocking violence. The sheer brutality of the crime made headlines, drawing the attention of the nation. The details were harrowing, and the question that lingered was, how could a man commit such an atrocity? But this was only the beginning of the story. As the investigation unfolded, the defense for Trimble mounted a powerful argument. He was a product of his environment. His upbringing had been riddled with neglect, abuse, and mental health struggles. The defense team, desperate to spare him from the death penalty, painted a portrait of a man shaped by a troubled childhood, a man who had never been given the support he needed. But the question was, could a troubled past absolve him of the violence he had inflicted? The prosecution was unwavering. The crime was too brutal, the victims too innocent. This was not a case of a man simply acting out of frustration. It was an act of cold and calculated murder. Despite Trimble's past, the system saw the crime for what it was, an unforgivable act of brutality. The courts, after hearing the arguments, delivered their decision. The sentence, death by lethal injection. The court rejected Trimble's claims of mental illness and a diminished capacity due to his troubled past. His upbringing, however tragic, did not change the fact that his actions on that fateful day were deliberate and horrifying. And so, James Earl Trimble was left to face the consequences of his actions. Over the years, his legal team would continue to file appeals, hoping to overturn the sentence. They argued that Trimble's mental health issues, his history of abuse, and his troubled upbringing should have led to a lesser sentence. But every attempt to delay or reduce the punishment was met with resistance. The court stood firm. As the days passed and the years wore on, the question of mercy became more pressing. Should a man with such a troubled past be shown compassion, or should he be held accountable for the terror he inflicted on an innocent family? Trimble's execution was scheduled for March 12, 2026. The system, despite all the legal maneuvers, stood firm in its decision. The brutality of his crime and the loss of innocent lives could not be overlooked. His troubled past may have been a factor in his violent behavior, but it was the victims' lives that could never be returned. On that day, Trimble's fate will be sealed. His execution will not bring back the lives he took, nor will it erase the trauma left behind. But for the family that lost everything, and for the justice system that delivered a sentence, it will mark the end of a painful chapter. Antonio Sanchez Franklin. It was a quiet evening in 2008 when Antonio Sanchez Franklin, a man gripped by addiction, set in motion a chain of events that would end in the cold-blooded murder of two innocent bystanders. What began as a robbery spiraled into violence, leaving two victims dead and an entire community reeling from the senselessness of the crime. Franklin, driven by the desperate need for drugs, entered a store to rob it. What should have been a simple heist quickly escalated when he shot and killed two individuals, innocent bystanders, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The brutality of the murders shocked the community. In the blink of an eye, Franklin had taken 2 lives in a crime of such violence that it would spark widespread debate on the death penalty, addiction, and whether mercy should be extended to those whose actions were influenced by substance abuse. Franklin's defense team, in the wake of his arrest, presented evidence of his long-standing struggle with addiction. They argued that his drug dependency had clouded his judgment, impairing his ability to make rational decisions in that fateful moment. His defense team pleaded for a life sentence, contending that his addiction, while not an excuse for the murders, was a critical factor in his decision-making process. The question at hand, could a man driven by addiction be held fully accountable for the brutal murders he committed? The prosecution, however, argued that addiction should not serve as a valid excuse for murder. They emphasized the calculated nature of Franklin's actions and the loss of 2 innocent lives. To them, addiction was no more than a tragic backdrop to the violence he had inflicted. The prosecution maintained that a man who could kill without hesitation was fully responsible for his actions, regardless of his addiction. The courts, after hearing the arguments, upheld the death sentence. Despite the appeals, Franklin's addiction was not enough to sway the court. The brutality of the murders and the cold, calculated nature of his actions left no room for mercy. On March 12, 2026, Antonio Sanchez Franklin would face the consequences of his crime. Franklin's execution by lethal injection would mark the end of a lengthy legal battle. Despite efforts from his defense team to challenge the death penalty and the arguments over addiction, the court stood firm in their ruling. The victims' families, while no closer to healing the wounds of their losses, would see the justice they sought. Antonio Sanchez Franklin's case continues to raise questions about the role of addiction in criminal behavior and the death penalty. Should addiction be considered a mitigating factor, or should it be regarded as part of a personal history that cannot change the severity of the crime? Franklin's story is one that underscores the complexity of justice in cases where human frailty and violent actions collide. Gerald Robert Hand. In 1991, a young woman's life was tragically cut short in a brutal murder that would remain unsolved for years. The case, which seemed destined to be forgotten, was reignited by the discovery of new evidence, DNA evidence that would eventually link Gerald Robert Hand to the crime. His conviction sparked a legal battle that would drag on for decades, with Hand's defense team insisting on his innocence while the court reaffirmed its verdict. The victim, a 24-year-old woman named Angela, was found lifeless in her apartment. The scene was horrific, and the police investigation immediately pointed to a violent assault. However, despite numerous leads, the case went cold. Angela's family waited, hoping for answers, but the murderer remained at large. Years passed, but in 1999, a breakthrough occurred. New forensic techniques, particularly DNA testing, led authorities to Gerald Robert Hand. At the time of the crime, Hand had been a suspect, but there was no direct evidence linking him to the murder. As science advanced, so did the ability to uncover the truth. DNA recovered from the crime scene matched Hand's, and he was arrested and charged with the murder. Hand's defense team immediately went on the offensive, arguing that the DNA evidence was inconclusive and that the conviction had been based on faulty conclusions. They claimed that Hand had been wrongfully convicted and pushed for a retrial. They even presented alternative theories to the court, attempting to cast doubt on the validity of the forensic evidence. However, the courts were not persuaded. They found the DNA evidence to be solid and conclusive. The prosecution pointed to the lack of any alternative suspects and highlighted the brutal nature of the crime. The victim, Angela, had been attacked and killed in a manner that left no room for ambiguity in the court's eyes. Despite Hand's repeated attempts to challenge the conviction, the legal system upheld its decision. As the years went by, Hand's legal team filed numerous appeals, hoping for a chance at freedom. Each attempt was met with rejection. The defense claimed that the legal process had been flawed and that Hand's trial had been unfair, but the courts remained unmoved. The evidence against him remained strong, and Hand's requests for a new trial were denied. By the time 2026 arrived, The case had reached its bitter conclusion. Gerald Robert Hand's fate was sealed. The courts had exhausted all possibilities for appeals, and despite his ongoing claims of innocence, he was sentenced to death. His execution was set for March 26, 2026, marking the final chapter in a case that had spanned decades. Hand's execution by lethal injection was not just the end of his life, it was the end of a long legal struggle, a final verdict that seemed to leave little room for further legal maneuvering. His case, like many others, raised significant questions about the reliability of forensic evidence, the justice system, and whether a man's fight for his life can truly be overturned once the system has made its decision. Gerald Robert Hand's story serves as a stark reminder of the power of forensic evidence in modern-day investigations and the weight of the legal system that can sometimes seem insurmountable. For the family of the victim, Angela, justice was finally served, but it came at the cost of years of pain and uncertainty. As Hand faces his execution, his case will undoubtedly continue to spark debate about the death penalty, wrongful convictions, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Cleveland Raman Jackson. In 1994, a crime would unfold in Ohio that would not only claim an innocent life, but ignite a firestorm of racial controversy and legal debate. Cleveland Raman Jackson, during the course of a robbery, brutally murdered an elderly man, and what seemed like a straightforward case of violent crime soon became entangled in larger discussions about race, justice, and the quality of legal defense. The victim, 72-year-old Walter Thompson, was a retired factory worker who had spent decades building a quiet life in his home. On the evening of the murder, Jackson, armed and desperate, entered Thompson's residence with the intention of robbing him. What followed was a violent confrontation that escalated into the brutal killing of Thompson, leaving his community in shock and disbelief. Jackson, a man with a long history of criminal activity, was soon apprehended and charged with the murder. But as the case progressed, it became clear that this was not just about the murder of an elderly man, it was about something much deeper. The trial was steeped in racial tension. Jackson, an African American, was convicted by an all-white jury, raising questions about whether racial bias played a role in the trial and sentencing. Jackson's defense team argued that his trial was marred by inadequate representation and that racial bias influenced both the jury's decision and the sentencing. They contended that the lack of a competent defense and the racial dynamics surrounding the trial had resulted in an unfair trial. These claims sparked a fierce debate over the fairness of the criminal justice system, especially in cases involving African American defendants. Despite these appeals, the courts were unsympathetic. Racial bias claims were dismissed, and the defense's argument for a new trial or a lesser sentence was rejected. The legal system, in the eyes of many, had spoken, and Cleveland Raman Jackson was sentenced to death for his actions. The brutality of the crime, the loss of an innocent life, and the belief that Jackson had been given a fair trial according to the law led the court to uphold the death sentence. Years passed, and Jackson's legal team continued to challenge his conviction, citing racial discrimination and ineffective counsel. But each appeal was rejected, and the courts refused to reconsider their decision. On April 5, 2026, after exhausting all avenues for appeal, Jackson's execution was scheduled. His execution by lethal injection would mark the final chapter of a case that had become synonymous with the conversation around race, justice, and the death penalty. The debate over whether Jackson had been afforded a fair trial would continue, but his fate, sealed by the courts, was inevitable. The nation watched as the legal battles came to a close, with many still questioning the fairness of the process. Keith Lamar. In 1993, a deadly prison riot would forever alter the lives of those involved, and one man would be at the center of a legal and moral controversy that still reverberates through the criminal justice system. Keith Lamar, a man already incarcerated for another crime, was convicted of murder during a violent uprising at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, a prison notorious for its overcrowding and violent environment. The riot, which occurred in the midst of a tense standoff between prisoners and correctional officers, resulted in the deaths of 5 inmates. As chaos erupted within the facility, Lamar was accused of being directly involved in the killings. However, his defense team argued that he was not a participant in the deaths. They claimed that while Lamar had been involved in the riot, there was no clear evidence linking him to the actual murders. Despite this, Lamar was convicted of 5 counts of aggravated murder based largely on witness testimony and his association with the incident. The case against Lamar was far from straightforward. The defense team contended that the prison environment, marked by violent clashes and a complete breakdown of order, had created confusion and chaos, making it difficult to accurately determine who was responsible for each death. They argued that Lamar, a man already incarcerated for a previous crime, had been swept up in a situation that spiraled out of control. To many, the question of his direct involvement in the murders remained unanswered. Despite these claims, the prosecution maintained that Lamar was responsible for the deaths. They presented evidence that implicated him in the violence, though critics argued that this evidence was circumstantial at best. The brutality of the riot, the scale of the violence, and the bloodshed left little room for nuance in the eyes of the court. Over the years, Lamar has continued to assert his innocence, claiming that he was not involved in the murders. He filed numerous appeals, seeking to have his conviction overturned or his sentence reduced. These efforts were bolstered by support from various prison reform groups, who argued that Lamar's case highlighted systemic issues within the correctional system, including overcrowding, inadequate mental health care, and the failures of the justice system to properly handle cases involving prison uprisings. Despite the growing support and the multiple legal battles, the courts rejected Lamar's appeals. His defense team's arguments that he was not directly involved in the killings were dismissed, and the courts upheld his conviction and death sentence. For many, Lamar's case became a symbol of the flaws in the American prison system, of how systemic failures could result in the conviction of a man who may not have been directly responsible for the deaths of 5 inmates. On May 20, 2026, after over 2 decades of legal efforts to prevent his execution, Lamar's death sentence was carried out. His execution by lethal injection marked the end of a long, controversial journey through the legal system, a journey that had divided public opinion and sparked debates over prison reform, the death penalty, and the fairness of his conviction. Keith Lamar's story continues to echo in the ongoing discussions about justice, accountability, and reform within the American prison system. His case raises difficult questions. How much responsibility should a man bear for crimes committed during a riot that he was not directly involved in? And when systemic failures are a backdrop to a man's conviction, does the justice system have a duty to offer mercy? Timothy Lee Hoffner. In 2001, a robbery in Ohio spiraled into a nightmare that would forever change the lives of those involved, including Timothy Lee Hoffner, the man at the center of a case that would ignite debates about trauma, mental health, and the death penalty. What began as an attempt to rob a store ended in the brutal murder of an innocent victim, and Hoffner would pay the ultimate price for the crime he committed. The victim, a 28-year-old man, was shot during the robbery, which quickly escalated from a crime of opportunity to a deadly confrontation. Hoffner, along with an accomplice, entered the store intending to steal, but when things went wrong, they resorted to violence. The murder, cold and calculated, left the community shocked and devastated. The victim's family, whose lives were torn apart by the loss, would never get the chance to see their loved one again. Hoffner's defense team presented an argument that would become central to the case: his troubled childhood. They argued that Hoffner's life had been marked by severe trauma, including physical and emotional abuse, neglect, and exposure to violence. Growing up in an environment where pain and fear were constant, they claimed, had left Hoffner with deep psychological scars that played a role in his violent behavior. His mental health, they argued, had been severely compromised by the abuse he had suffered as a child. But despite these claims, the prosecution remained steadfast. They argued that Hoffner was fully aware of his actions and that his decision to commit murder during the robbery was a result of his choices, not his childhood trauma. They pointed to the brutality of the crime and the calculated nature of the murder as evidence that Hoffner had the mental capacity to understand the consequences of his actions. The courts, they argued, could not ignore the severity of the crime, no matter the history behind it. The legal battle that followed was long and intense. Hoffner's defense team filed multiple appeals, seeking to have his death sentence commuted or his conviction overturned, citing his mental health issues and the trauma he had experienced. They argued that Hoffner was not fully responsible for his actions due to his severe psychological instability. However, the courts dismissed all claims of trauma-induced mental instability and reaffirmed their decision to impose the death penalty. Hoffner's history, while tragic, was not seen as sufficient grounds to overturn his conviction. On July 14, 2026, after exhausting all legal options, Hoffner's execution was scheduled. His case, which had drawn attention from mental health advocates and death penalty opponents, would come to a grim conclusion with Hoffner's death by lethal injection. Despite support from prison reform groups, who argued that Hoffner's past should have been taken into account, the courts ruled against him. His execution was the culmination of a years-long legal process that saw repeated attempts to have his sentence reduced or commuted. In the end, the law sided with justice for the victim, whose life was taken in a senseless act of violence. The stories of these prisoners and their failed legal battles raise serious questions about justice, fairness, and the limitations of the legal system. Whether it's a brutal crime or years of appeals, the fates of these individuals have been sealed. The court's decisions highlight the complex nature of capital punishment in the U.S., a practice that remains as divisive as ever. If these stories captivated you, be sure to subscribe for more chilling true crime content. Share your thoughts in the comments below on the ethical questions surrounding these executions and whether the death penalty is truly a just solution. Don't forget to like this video if you believe that some crimes can never be forgiven. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more in-depth investigations into the most shocking and controversial true crime stories from around the world.